I think it illustrates a profound aspect of the IIoT, which is that when you open up the data to multiple users and multiple perspectives and multiple individuals, get insights that even the most brilliant data scientist working in isolation just isn't going to come up with.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is the Digital Supply Chain Podcast, the #1 podcast focusing on the digitization of supply chain. And I'm your host, Global Vice President at SAP, Tom Raftery. Hi everyone, welcome to the Digital Supply Chain Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery with SAP, and with me on the show today, I have David. David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm David Stephenson, and I head Stephenson Strategies in Massachusetts. And I have been an IoT consultant for about 8 years at this point. And I got into the field based on work that I had done for the District of Columbia, opening up all sorts of real-time databases and then inviting the public to come in and write apps based on that. And so I was very much involved in the beginnings of the whole open data movement.
Nice.
And I see that as a real commonality here, that one of the critical things about the IoT is sharing data, not hoarding it. And that was what really has always shaped my perspective on this. And I wrote a book, I think it's still the only book on IoT strategy 2 years ago for HarperCollins called The Future is Smart. And I particularly work in two areas, one of which is very relevant to what we're doing, talking about today, which is the impact of the IoT on reducing environmental impacts and global warming. And the other is sort of a defensive measure, frankly, given my age. It's it's the topic of the next book I'm writing called Smart Aging, that is applying the IoT to improving the aging process.
Interesting.
But so particularly, Tom, common thing that I know you had a guest on several weeks ago about talking about using the IoT and artificial intelligence to improve predictability of arrival times and things like that for ocean shipping. And I write a regular column for Industry Week on IoT. And I did one several months ago about this. And I was frankly flabbergasted that there is this one area that is a huge segment of global commerce and is still largely insulated from the IoT.
Yep. Now,
and that is ocean shipping. And it reminds me of the old maps, from the 1500s of the serpent in the unmapped areas. Yes, exactly, of the oceans. And ironically, from a data standpoint, we're not all that far from that now. And that really has very, very practical implications. It means that the ships are unable to optimize their course based on real-time weather data and emerging data patterns, weather patterns and things of that sort. It means that they're more vulnerable to deep sea sinkings and a variety of other issues on that. Fortunately, that's something that's going down now as a pattern, but it's still a big issue. And then you've got the whole issue of terrorism and piracy. Right. So it's like we have all of this advanced industry everywhere else. All the other components of the supply chain are really advanced. And if there's one thing that I think that COVID has pointed out to us, is how critical the supply chain is in a way that the vast majority of people, people like us understood it, but the vast majority of people didn't. And now, suddenly, that is front and center. And yet we've got this big area that is still terra incognita.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I had that conversation with that company that you mentioned, Portcast. They're called Portcast.io, where they use machine learning and all kinds of data sources to predict the arrival or departure times of ships and containers. But what was amazing was that they had to use all these disparate data sources to try and do a best guess, because the containers and the ships themselves typically don't give off that data. So they're using all kinds of other feeds, like, political news feeds on conditions in and around the ports. So they'll know if and when a ship is likely to leave, rather than actually, getting the data and being able to see, oh, look, the ship is departing now. Something that you could do with most other forms of transport, like your UPS truck, for example.
Right. And, interesting, you mentioned UPS truck. I would draw an analogy to one of their competitors, to FedEx. And that was that in 2009, long before we were talking in general about the IoT, FedEx came up with a very clever premium service called SenseAware.
Right.
And, those were containers that were very sensor laden and were used for cargo that had very sensitive contents, where, for example, light, heat, a variety of other things could affect it, including parts for transplants.
Wow.
There isn't anything that is more sensitive than that kind of thing. And they've been able to charge a premium for that kind of thing now for over 10 years. And it's just starting to happen in the ocean shipping area. Maersk, the big Danish firm that really is the kingpin of that whole industry. It's funny, there's on the website, there's a headline that talks about the smartest metal containers you can buy. And what they are doing now is they are taking the concept of SenseAware, and it's now writ large with entire multimodal ocean shipping containers.
Okay.
And they have state-of-the-art refrigeration. They have sensors, again, for exposure to light if the container is opened on the ocean and things of that sort.
Okay, wow.
And they're now able, they've got a great, I believe the app is called Captain Pete.
Captain Pete.
That if you subscribe to Captain Pete, for a price, then you have access to real-time data about your cargo and its location. And that's something that, again, we've been implementing to a great extent in all sorts of things in other aspects of business, but comes as like a great revelation when it's applied to ocean shipping.
It's weird, isn't it? I mean, I guess I can understand it to an extent. These ships are, out of range of land, particularly if they're going across the Pacific or something like that. So access to cellular communications technologies is gone. So you're relying on satellite communications, which typically is a lot more expensive than cellular. So it would only be high ticket items that would be able to do that. And, ships would probably communicate with satellites a couple of times a day just to download weather patterns or whatever.
Well, and actually one of the options that, even though they are required by the International Maritime Organization to have the communications data or the communications tools on board, they can also turn them off.
Yeah.
Which I find incredible in this day and age. I don't think that's optional anymore. You keep that thing on.
Yeah.
And it's there are, get this, there are literally some ocean-going shipping containers and ships where they are in the paper and pencil age still. It is astounding that could be the case, but it is.
Wow.
And I think one of the things that we're seeing now is that with all of the refinements in other aspects of the supply chain that it's intolerable to have this void right in the middle of the thing. And there is an astounding percentage, the vast majority of all commerce still at one point or another uses ocean shipping. So it really is intolerable that we have that void. And thank goodness they're addressing it. Actually, one of my favorite examples of this that goes back at least 5 or 6 years ago is from SAP with the Port of Hamburg.
Oh yeah,
and it's got a macro system, but with a really interesting micro application as part of it. At any rate, they are doing everything possible to monitor every aspect of traffic in the port, and it has led to all sorts of great increases in productivity and waste reduction. At the same time, my favorite aspect of this is, I think it's probably still around, because the data is shared amongst all those who need it, because a port is just an incredibly complex facility with, amongst other things, a lot of really important safety issues.
Right, of course.
And so one of the things that they do in Hamburg is, if a drawbridge is going to be up for a certain period of time, they let the drivers of the containers know that, and they get from the coffee shop that is near them in the port, they get a discount coupon they know that they can run in there, get a cup of coffee, because they know that drawbridge isn't going to open for a certain amount of time. And it seems silly, but I think it illustrates a profound aspect of the IIoT, which is that when you open up the data to multiple users and multiple perspectives and multiple individuals, get insights that even the most brilliant data scientist working in isolation just isn't going to come up with. And the other thing that's interesting about that is, once somebody does come up with something like that, it spawns others to think, well, that's interesting. If they can do that, then they could do this or whatever. Yeah. And you get this virtuous cycle that is created. Actually, the last chapter of my book, I talked about what I called the circular corporation, which was getting away from silos. And again, we see that so much in ports and with shipping and everything. And instead, by this real-time sharing of real-time data, to go break down the information silos and bring about collaboration between different functions. And I am convinced that is going to lead to unprecedented precision and also unlimited ingenuity and innovation as well.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories in that kind of scenario of information sharing comes from Continental. Continental are one of our big customers. They're a German company. You probably know them as a tire company, but
yes.
Only 40% of their revenue comes from their rubber products. The other 60% comes from the kind of smarts and connectivity that they sell directly to the automobile manufacturers. If you have a car, there's a high likelihood that part of the components of your car were manufactured by Continental and sold directly to the manufacturer. So Continental decided to build this thing they called their remote vehicle data network. And the idea was it was going to be a predictive maintenance, or it is going to be because they're still doing it. It's a predictive maintenance play. The idea being is that they would sell it to fleet managers and also to service center managers, so that the service center would become sticky for the customers, because, typically you don't care which service center you bring your car to. But if you're going to a service center where the manager says to you, listen, sign up for this service and we'll tell you ahead of time if a component of your car is going to fail. We'll have it ordered in ahead of time so it's in stock, and we'll swap it out before it has failed, and we'll do it in 15, 20 minutes. If you had that kind of service, you'd be more likely to go back to that service center. So that was the logic. And obviously for fleet managers, very important to have predictive maintenance for the fleets of vehicles as well. So that was what they were building. They were building this remote vehicle data platform. And as they were building it, they were approached by a weather company. And the weather company said to them, listen, you're collecting all this data from cars and vehicles, right? Time of day, GPS, external air temperature, windscreen wiper status, fog light status, etc. The weather company realized that these cars were little mini weather stations constantly broadcasting real-time geolocated weather data, and that would be hugely valuable information to the weather company. And so the two organizations, Continental and the weather company, have worked together. And the last time I spoke to the guy, Christian Bessler, who told me this story, they were going ahead with it. They have to, dot the I's and cross the T's and all the privacy and security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's now a completely different left field source of revenue from a predictive maintenance project that hadn't occurred to them at all.
Exactly. Predictive maintenance is such a huge aspect of the IIoT. I liken it in my book. I had a chapter that I referred to as collective blindness. Turns out there was this condition that affected the entire human race. Every single person, nobody was exempted from collective blindness. And the way collective blindness manifested itself was that once a product left the factory door, we didn't have a clue how it was actually being used or misused. And so, for example, the whole thing of scheduled maintenance was largely based on guesstimates.
Yep.
And now we're, again, with predictive maintenance, and I think the best example of that, not to get a little far afield with another aspect of transportation, is jet turbines, where basically the sales of jet turbines have plummeted in recent years. And the companies, other than right now during COVID when nobody's buying them, but before that, nobody was worried. And the reason was that the product was being replaced with a service. And Rolls-Royce was really the pioneer on that now you're only paying for it. It's called powered by the hour. And you're only paying when that turbine is in the air and generating thrust. If it's sitting being repaired, it's not going to bring in any money. And another thing, Tom, that's really neat, and I suspect on these ocean-going containers, we're going to see more and more of this in the near future. I haven't actually seen any mention of it so far, but I'm going out on a limb and predicting it, that you're going to see 3D printers on those ships, because with predictive maintenance, here they are in the middle of nowhere. They're not going to be able to just drop a part in there. They will actually manufacture that spare part that has been predicted to be needed, and they'll have it right there without having to depend on any outside supplier. Incredible, absolutely amazing.
You said as well at the start, David, that you were into using IoT for environmental reasons. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Oh, yes. This goes back to a passion of mine for many, many years, which is that I always thought that a lot of the resistance on the part of corporations, particularly in the 90s, to environmental things was largely a communications and lifestyle kind of thing, that they thought this was something that was being imposed on them, and they associated with a lot of regulatory compliance and stuff like that, rather than as a way to reduce inefficiency and waste. Mm-hmm. And that's the way I've always come at environmental issues. And I think that's really the case with the IoT, that being able, say, for example, with shipping, whether it's on terrestrial transportation or on the oceans, that you're able to bring about, because of that integration of the real-time weather data and all these things that they were never able to do before. You can really reduce the impacts. Right now in 2020, there are new requirements going into effect this year on reducing the emissions from the fuel that these ships are using.
Right. Yeah.
And they're just not going to be able to do that without real-time data. And and also one of the things that's neat with this concept of replacing goods with services is that, going back to my example of the jet turbines, people are not going to be, companies are not going to be replacing their turbines as much. What they're going to be doing, and this will lead to much greater loyalty on the part of customers, because as long as your needs are being met,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to tend to stay with your supplier, that they will do incremental upgrades. And sometimes that's really just a software upgrade. And they will meet the needs that way. And that is going to continually increase efficiency without requiring scrapping of the product and replacing it with an all new one. So I think we're going to see a lot of that kind of innovation with services replacing sales.
Yeah, and I mean, I had a conversation with a guy called Tom Kurtz, which I published last Friday on this podcast, about that kind of thing, and about the shift to product as a service. And it was interesting, because one of the other key things, as you alluded to there, is that previously companies only had a guess of how their product was used in the wild, but now they get real-time data back and they can see how it's actually being used. And so you can feed that data into the development organization and go, see, this is how it's actually being used. So in future, you need to optimize for this kind of operating environment for our device. So, you know, versions 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 are far better because they're based on actual usage data rather than previous guesstimates.
Couldn't agree more. And, you know, in the past, product design and maintenance didn't talk to each other.
Yeah.
There was really no reason. And now, this, again, going back to this concept of the circular company, circular management, that operating data that the product design people didn't have access to either. They were, particularly doing upgrades. They were doing it in a void and guesstimating what customers really might like. And the other thing is, what are the things that data shows that customers are having problems with, and where they can remove some of those obstacles to, again, improve operating efficiency. And that was totally impossible. And now we can have the product design people talking to the maintenance people and sharing insights. And that's where you're going to get that kind of creativity that I was talking about.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, from your example of sending out the coffee vouchers to the truckers in Hamburg, to the Continental using predictive maintenance for weather prediction, to, you know, the changing the design of devices based on actual operating data, it all talks to the importance of data, and you never knowing what the data you're collecting might be used for. There are always the possibility of left field uses that hadn't occurred to you. So data and data collection are hugely important.
Exactly. And, and actually, let me just mention one other thing in that regard that I'm very excited about, is that, let's go back to the ships. There's the whole concept now of low-code, no-code apps that are particularly designed for users. And I'm thinking in this case, ships' crews, where you're not going to send a software designer out on the ship on there, but they are running into issues all the time where being able to apply that real-time data will be very important for them. And so there are a number of startup companies now that are creating these apps that allow basically drag and drop for people on the front lines who have a need to take that data. And they're not doing the macro, big sky kind of stuff. They need to plan for what they're going to do in the next 8-hour shift.
Sure.
And they're able to actually do that now. And it empowers those workers. It's obviously there is a real push to, through efficiency, reduce workforces and all that. You're still going to have a lot of human beings involved in all of these things, and particularly on ships. Mm-hmm. And you need to use that and give them the tools that they would need to take that data that we are going to be gathering, thank God, and apply it to their specific needs. So we've got this whole continuum from, on one end, the big macro design of the ships and design of the intermodal shipping containers and things like that. And then on the other end, you've got these guys who are responsible for what are they going to do that day when there's a storm predicted. And the IIoT really can span that whole thing and bring about unprecedented degree of efficiency and removing that big void from ocean shipping.
I got to imagine that Starlink will make a huge difference to ocean shipping companies.
Yeah, exactly. Couldn't agree more.
So listen, we're gone over 20 minutes at this point, David, and I normally like to keep it to between 20 to 30 minutes. Is there any question I've not asked that you think I should have? Any points that we've not brought up that you think it's important for people to be aware of?
Well, I would bring it to a close by one of my favorite things. I used to do corporate crisis management, and when I would meet a client for the first time, they never were happy to see me because when I walked in the door, they knew they were in trouble. And I always used to hand them a very nice card with the Chinese ideogram for crisis, Weiji, that combines the ones for danger and opportunity. Now, I know that there is some controversy about whether that's really accurate or not, but let's pretend for the purpose of this discussion that it is. And so right now, we are in an absolutely unprecedented situation. It's not just COVID. It's the whole issue of systemic racism and everything, and global warming. Yep. You see what is happening in California right now. It is just absolutely horrific. And then in the Gulf Coast right now with the hurricane that's heading that way. And we don't have the luxury of ducking on these things. And I am convinced that the IoT, by virtue of this ability to collect and share real-time data, is going to be one of the real secrets allowing us to get around these problems. And yes, right now the danger is abundantly obvious, but I maintain that there is also real opportunity hidden there too that we simply would not have been presented with in normal times. And it's really hard. I know personally, I'm still having trouble grasping the whole thing. My wife spent 2 months turning obese men who were dying on a COVID floor at a hospital.
God.
And that spilled over to me because that put me at huge risk. Yeah. And so I know how hard it is to cope now, but I think we need to not just cope day to day, but take this as the opportunity that it really is to do some incredibly creative thinking and capitalize on this data that we're being presented with for the first time. And I'm convinced that that's going to lead to progress in every aspect of business and our personal lives.
I agree 100%. David, if people want to know more about you, yourself, or any of the things we talked about, where would you have me direct them?
Sure. My website is Stephenson with a PH, strategies.com. And then also I do a continuing column for Industry Week on the IIoT. And those would be, and then also my books. The Future is Smart is for sale. And I think it's still, even though it's 2 years old now, it's still really relevant, particularly with these attitudinal shifts that we're going to need to make to really capitalize on the IoT.
David, that's been fantastic. Thanks a million for coming on the show today.
Tom, I really appreciate it. It's fantastic. And, you're a legend in the futurist world. So it's a real honor to be able to be on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Okay, we've come to the end of the show. Thanks everyone for listening. If you'd like to know more about digital supply chains, head on over to sap.com/digital supply chain or simply drop me an email to tom.raftery@sap.com. If you like the show, please don't forget to subscribe to it in your podcast application of choice to get new episodes as soon as they're published. Also, please don't forget to rate and review the podcast. It really does help new people to find the show. Thanks. Catch you all next time.